Well, yeah, thanks, Rebecca, for the warm welcome. Glad to be here. My name is Daniil. Just a little bit about myself. So, I am a senior cybersecurity analyst at PwC. So, I've been working there for about 4 years, based out of the Vancouver office. Um, and it's been quite the journey so far. A lot of what I do is helping businesses with their cybersecurity strategy, and then even helping them towards, implementing that strategy and kind of helping them grow their cybersecurity maturity. Um, Kind of my main focus in cybersecurity is related to identities. So, in your organization, that would be, employees that you hire or contractors or other people that you work with that are within your organization. So I mainly help organizations, secure those identities and make sure, the people aspect of cybersecurity is accounted for and taken care of. And we'll go into a lot more detail during our presentation on, what that all means, but that's just a little bit about me and sort of my background. Rishav, over to you.
Thanks, Vineal and Rebecca. Hey, folks, my name is Rishabh. I'm a senior cyber strategist with PwC Canada as well. I've been here with PwC for a number of years, and I primarily focus on the governance and risk management space of cybersecurity, working a lot with medium to large enterprises across Canada. I have experience in a lot of different industries, from government and public sector to financial services to mining, energy, and industries of that sort. Recently, I've also been dabbling in the space of vulnerability management and asset management, but my primary focus, like I mentioned, is on governance and risk management. So excited to be here today. Excited for the foundation for having us and for any questions that you folks may have. All right, back to you, Rebecca. Or is it up to us now to kind of take it away?
Yeah, please. You can share your slides now.
All right, then let's jump into it.
All right. Everyone able to see my screen okay? Perfect. So let me move forward here. We did have an introduction slide as well, but we'll skip that, seeing as we already introduced ourselves. So just wanted to quickly talk about the main objectives for today's session. I know, cybersecurity is kind of maybe a new topic for a lot of folks on the call. And, it can be a little daunting to, think about cybersecurity. There's, a lot of things being said, like a lot of things in the news. So, our first objective for today's call would just be to understand the importance of cybersecurity for small businesses, what it is, what it isn't, and then move on to some of the common security threats. You may have heard things like phishing, ransomware, insider threats. So we'll go into a little bit more detail. What does that mean? Why is it relevant for you? And then we'll kind of end off the presentation on some practical tips and best practices that you can use, starting today on how to enhance the security of your organizations or your small businesses, or even things that you could use in your day-to-day life and in personal life as well. So that being said, let me quickly jump over to our agenda. Um, I'll just go through this really quickly. We'll spend, a lot more time on this during the call, but um, like I mentioned, we'll start off with why cybersecurity matters for small businesses. We'll go into um, common cybersecurity threats facing small businesses. Again, tips on cybersecurity you can use starting today. We'll go into a little bit more detail on awareness and training, why cybersecurity training is important, what does it look like, how you can start implementing it. We'll also look at cybersecurity insurance. What are the different types, why you may or may not want it, and what are some of the factors that influence your decisions around cyber insurance. And then we'll close off with some quick wins and some additional resources that you can look at after the call. Cybersecurity is a broad topic, and we can't cover everything in one session. So, want to encourage everyone to look at the additional resources, spend a little bit more time to learn more about cyber, and then we'll have the Q&A at the end. Like Rebecca mentioned, if you have any questions, you can drop them in the chat, and we'll be happy to take questions at the end. All right. So moving on then, I'm going to hand it over to Rishav to um, talk about the small and medium-sized businesses and why they're attractive targets for cybersecurity.
Sure. Thanks, Vineal, and thanks for the introduction as well. Why don't you just click it into some of the content for the next piece?
Sure.
So, cybersecurity, cyber threats, cyber actors, like it's a lot of different terms, a lot of different events that may be thrown around, and folks may be wondering, what's relevant to me? Why do I even care about cyber? I'm a smaller business, why would they be even after me when a lot of the bigger companies like banks and government sector companies have a lot more data, a lot more money that is obviously more attractive to organizations or malicious actors than myself? Well, let me tell you, that's just simply not true. Small and medium-sized businesses are actually very attractive to malicious actors simply because, well, you see the points on the screen, but it's because they understand that they have limited resources to protect themselves, right? If I'm a malicious actor and I think I have to put in X amount of effort to get certain data, something that is worth something, and I have to fight through or work through either a lot of different security controls or less security controls, I'm going to choose something that requires less effort at the end of the day, right? So we've got some statistics on screen about what that looks like. At the end of the day, 43% of cyber attacks or reported cyber attacks that we hear about are on smaller businesses at the end of the day. And these are statistics from the Government of Canada, so this is relevant to the Canadian market. But only 14% of small to medium-sized businesses are actually prepared to face such an attack. And this really comes down to the fact that a lot of small businesses think that they're actually too small to be relevant to malicious actors or even in the cyberspace, which simply isn't true. Cyber attacks and even in the cyberspace, right? It really comes down to it's a matter of when, if it's gonna happen, not if or not if. So you're not protected simply because of your size at the end of the day. Now, why, you might be wondering, right? Like, why would malicious actors want to go after me as a small business with limited resources, with smaller revenues, smaller size of employees than some of the bigger fish in the sea? There's a lot of different reasons, actually. So some of the main ones that I think we want to cover are, first of all, limited resources. This might actually be the biggest one that makes smaller companies more attractive than the bigger fish in the sea. Smaller organizations and smaller businesses have smaller teams. They have smaller resource pools. They can't they can be invested in some of the tools, some of the controls that a lot of the bigger fish in the sea have access to. And that makes them attractive to a lot of the malicious actors. They know that you're simply not able to purchase the flashiest tools or get the most advanced security tools or pay for the most up-to-date security features at the end of the day. So they understand that because you're not able to do that and you have limited resources, it might just be easier to go after smaller businesses than some of the bigger fish. Two, and this actually is important as well, even though smaller businesses are in fact smaller with less resources, they still have the same type of information that bigger businesses would have. So this comes down to private information like personal information of clients or even financial information of their clients as well, like social insurance numbers or credit card information. That's the same type of information some of the bigger companies would have, right? So at the end of the day, you've got the same type of information and the same type of data that bigger organizations would have, but less resources to protect it. And that makes them a bit more attractive to malicious actors. The third part is that lack of employee training. So a lot of bigger organizations have dedicated security training and awareness programs that make them, or that keep them up to date at least on what the current cyber threats are, what are things they need to watch out for, and what are some tips and tricks that they can take advantage of to protect themselves and the companies. But a lot of smaller organizations actually lack that simply because they're a bit more focused on the operational fact than some of the side operations like cybersecurity, and because they're simply not revenue generating and as important for them. And fourth, last but not least, is the perceived lack of security measures that ties into some of the other things. Because of the limited resources, but the same amount of valuable data and the lack of security training, malicious actors think that, well, there's not as many security measures in place that would protect such organizations from their attacks. So it actually makes them more attractive, whether that be true or not true. Security at the end of the day is like having a higher fence, right? There's no such thing as 100% secure. You just want to be more secure than the folks next to you. So if I'm, if I take that example of having a higher fence, I want a stronger fence than my neighbor, so I look less attractive than they do, so that if a malicious actor does come down the line and they're trying to scope out some, what their next target is going to be, I want to look less attractive than someone else because there's no such thing as 100% security, right? So it's that perceived lack of security measures compared to some of the bigger fish that make smaller businesses seem just as attractive or even more attractive than them at the end of the day. Now you might be wondering, well, that's great, or maybe it's not so great. Yes, small businesses are on the target for malicious actors. Yes, they're very frequent targets as well, and there's a lot of reasons for being a frequent targets, but what is the impact of that at the end of the day? So Vineal, why don't you click that for me? Thank you very much. Well, the impact can vary across a lot of different streams, but the three main ones that some of our clients look at are financial, reputational, and operational. Financial is an easy one to understand, right? If you are hit with a cyber attack, there's going to be monetary impacts, whether that be financial penalties from regulators for losing client data. At the end of the day, if you're losing client information, especially sensitive information like names, social insurance number, addresses, credit card information, the government's going to come knocking. So there could be financial repercussions from that, as well as remediation costs as well for your technology stack. If your technology is no longer usable or it's insecure now that it's been, compromised, you're going to have to invest to improve it. So that's coming out of your bottom line. Second of all, reputational. And reputation is something that's important for small clients as well as big clients. Reputation is everything at the end of the day, right? So if your brand image is compromised because your clients can't trust you anymore, you're going to have a hard time building up your operations and scaling up your business. And finally, operational, which kind of ties into the financial and reputational impacts as well, simply because if your service is disrupted, you're not going to be able to actually run your business. And if your business is down, your bottom line is going to be affected. And on the bottom, we've got a stat that, the average cost of a data breach and a cyber attack is increasing year on year. And right now for 2024 or last 2023, it was reaching a couple million at the end of the day. And that's been an increase of tenfold from the year before. 2025 has just started. So let's see where that goes. But you can understand that it's getting worse and worse year on year. Why don't we go to the next slide, Vineal? So we've talked about what those threats can be and how and what the impacts of that are to business, but what are some of those common cyber threats that we may face on a day-to-day basis? So we've got some of the main ones that we see from our businesses and our clients. The main ones being social engineering, and as a subset of social engineering, phishing, ransomware, which is one of the hottest topics in the market right now, insider threats, which isn't as flashy as some of the other ones, but it's just as relevant, and then third-party vulnerabilities and third-party breaches, which are risks and vendor risks, which are just as important now, and they'll probably get more important in the future as well. You may be wondering, what do all these things mean if they're new topics to you? So social engineering is really when folks are kind of taken advantage of to reveal certain types of information that those malicious actors can use. And this comes down to things like phishing or vishing, where, I guess emails are kind of sent, or communication methods are sent to employees, and they might not be able to tell if they're legitimate or not, and then they get taken advantage of. At the end of the day, your security posture is only as good as your weakest link. And from what statistics tell us, the human element of security is usually the weakest link. So malicious actors really do try to take advantage of that human element as much as possible, and that's why phishing and social engineering is such a big threat vector into your environment. They've actually gotten a lot worse recently, simply because of the advent of generative AI. Before, it used to be like, you might remember things like, if you guys are old as me, like the Nigerian Prince, where shitty emails would be sent out, and there'd be like thousands of grammar mistakes that would make it seem like, okay, this isn't really legitimate. You can tell what's legitimate or not. But now, because generative AI makes it so easy to create legitimate looking phishing attacks or phishing attempts, that it's a lot harder to actually interpret what is real and what isn't. As an example, there was a recent event in Hong Kong a few months ago where someone used deepfakes to call an employee pretending to be the VP of their company. And they were able to use publicly available information from videos and conferences that VP had presented in to create very realistic sounding phone call and they call an employee of that company and they're like, hey, we need you to transfer X amount of dollars into my account. And that employee panicked because he's like, oh shit, my VP is calling me and I need to like get on this right now. And turned out to be fake. So the social engineering and scams of the sort are actually getting worse and worse now simply because generative AI is making it so much more easier and realistic to be able to get away with that. Ransomware, again, a hot topic simply because ransomware is hot because it makes money. And at the end of the day, that's what folks want to be able to do with this information, right? If they're able to lock down your operations and extort you for money, there's a benefit to them simply than by just disrupting your operations. And we're finding that ransomware is rising due to services like ransomware as a service, where these malicious actors are actually acting like businesses where they've got their own like IT teams and HR teams and financial teams that are extorting businesses for money, and they're actually trying to be as when I say legitimate, and when I say legitimate, right, it's like trying to be a real business where they want to, like, if they're actually extorting you and you pay them, they actually give you the keys to be able to decrypt your information that they've encrypted so that they're taken legitimately in the market and they actually do make money in the future. Malware, ransomware, what it is, if I haven't covered this yet, is where malicious actors are able to get into your environment, lock down your, either your databases or your operations and hold you at a ransom until you pay them to release it. So that's why that's why it's kind of been such a prevalent threat in the market. Insider threats, this one kind of gets glossed over, but I don't want to gloss over it because it is important, because at the end of the day, as much as there are malicious actors outside the environment, they could also exist within your environment. You never really know the true intentions of a person from like a half hour or 1 hour interview at the end of the day. Now, this could be malicious intentionally, or it could be unintentional. Folks can accidentally do something that releases certain types of information or accidentally mess up operations where it takes down your or business. And while it may not be malicious in certain sense, it's still something that we need to watch out for because at the end of the day, it affects our bottom line. And last but not least that we wanted to chat about was third-party or vendor risks. So as kind of technology becomes so much more and more ingrained in our business operations, we're increasingly dependent on other businesses to help support our own business. A big example of that is, like, I'm sure everybody here uses Microsoft for one reason or another, or something like Zoom. We're using Zoom right now to facilitate this presentation. We're using some SaaS apps here, some SaaS apps there, Dropbox for storing our data, or some other application for, like QuickBooks for managing our accounting software. We're dependent on so many third parties at the end of the day that not only do we need to watch out for our own cyber risks and our own posture, we also need to take into account of their cyber posture, because if they're affected at the end of the day, our operations are also affected. And a great example of that is that CrowdStrike incident that happened last summer. I don't know if folks are aware or not, but CrowdStrike makes this cybersecurity software that's used by a lot of the companies in the world, which is like a detection software that's installed on your computers and your servers. They rolled out a bad software update that bricked almost every Windows machine that operated it. Now, one of the biggest companies that was affected, a lot of them were, but like someone like Delta, the airline in the US, they had to shut down their operations for X number of hours, and they were faced with huge amounts of losses simply because they couldn't run their planes anymore. And that had nothing to do with themselves. It was like a third-party company that compromised their machines. So it might not seem relevant or as important, but it is at the end of the day just as much as something that's inside your company as well. So those are some of the common threats and scenarios of actors that we see. Just so for your information, right? If you're wondering, well, what do I have to really watch out for at the end of the day? These are some of the major ones that we see, and we would like to tell our clients to stay vigilant for. All right, Vinay, let's go to the next slide.
Thank you, Rishabh. So Rishabh's covered, why cybersecurity is important and some of the common ways that, malicious actors can attack your businesses. So what are some things that you can do to protect yourselves? We know with cybersecurity, there's a lot of things that you can do. So we wanted to highlight, 5 key areas where you can focus on, some things that small businesses can try to do today to help protect themselves. So, I'll just get right into it. The first one we have, starting off simple. This one has to do with passwords and how you're logging into systems. So, common things here, you may have heard of these already, but we want to use strong, unique passwords. We want to use a password manager if we can, And we also want to enable multi-factor authentication. Um, Multi-factor authentication, if you don't know what that means, that's usually that 6-digit code that you usually get on your phone when you try to log into somewhere. So, using that to as just another layer of, something that someone has to do in order to log in can help, deter a lot of malicious actors. Because not only do they need to know your username, your password, but they also need to be able to have access to your phone or be able to get that 6-digit code somehow in order to log into your account. So MFA, I would say, is one of the big ones, just to prevent folks from being able to get into your accounts. So I'll move on to the next one. I think passwords and MFA, most people know what that is. So I'll move on to the next one. The next one is software updates and patching. I know Rishabh just talked about CrowdStrike and how that nearly brought down an airline because they installed a software update that didn't work out well. But typically, software updates and patching, what it does is, a lot of security updates are usually packaged into these, regular software updates that you get on your operating system, on your applications. Anytime you're updating any piece of software, you do get a lot of features and new things, but under the hood, there are always a lot of security updates and fixes that they're trying to make. So making sure that you're always on the latest operating system, always on the latest version of the application, would be, one of the ways that you can really help prevent a lot of cybersecurity attacks. What typically happens is for old applications and old versions of software, there's a publicly available list of vulnerabilities that malicious actors can use to try to exploit. So if those ways to gain access to systems is publicly available, and you're using one of those outdated software, it just makes you a more likely target. One thing to just note here is, to prevent, what would happen for that airline situation, is maybe don't update on day one. Maybe wait a week, a couple of weeks, to see how that software update is performing on, other organizations and see if there's any issues with it, before you, roll it out across your organization or update to it immediately. Moving on, the next one is antivirus and firewalls. I guess for antivirus, I guess folks more or less would know what this means, but it's just the software that you install on your computer or your server to detect and remove malware. I'm sure a lot of folks know what this is already, but antivirus has gotten a lot better over the years, and they're able to detect and remove a lot more malware. So having this installed can definitely help. The other one here is firewalls. So, well, I guess if folks don't know what a firewall is, it's basically it prevents you from accessing different websites, basically, more or less. So it blocks either incoming or outgoing traffic. So it'll either prevent you from accessing a site or prevent a site from, being able to send you information. And configuring a firewall can be difficult, but there are a lot of out-of-the-box ways and configurations that you can, install and set up that block a lot of known malicious websites. So that's one of the quick wins that you could have is setting up a out-of-the-box firewall. Something is better than nothing. So even if it's not fine-tuned for your organization, if you have something in place that'll prevent some of the more common risks. Number 4 is secure Wi-Fi and physical security. So just some common things here. So for your organization, you can use only try to use approved software and tools. Sorry, I know a lot of organizations only have a certain list of approved software and tools that you're allowed to use. And if you don't have that in place, it would be good to create a list. Like these are our approved software that we're using. These are the SaaS applications that we're using. So Rashad was mentioning Dropbox and Microsoft. So just creating a list that these are all the tools that we're using. And if you are you using some other tool for sharing files, for example, if the company um, um, method for sharing files is Dropbox and someone is using their personal OneDrive, you can have that as part of the company software and approved tools to help mitigate some of that. So employees or people in your organization at least know what they are or are not allowed to use. A couple other things here on Wi-Fi, avoid using public Wi-Fi without a VPN. I think this one is a pretty well-known one by now. We just want to avoid, a malicious actor being able to intercept your network traffic and, being able to steal a password or know what you're doing online. And then again, similar to patching, just making sure your devices are patched with the latest security updates. And number 5 is backups. So for backups, this is more of a worst case scenario. If you are hit with a cybersecurity incident, we want to make sure that you at least have backups of your data. So the recommended way to store backups is to have 3 copies of your data, 2 on a different medium and 1 that's stored offsite. So different medium could be on a separate hard drive that you've backed up or stored on a cloud site, for example, and 1 that's stored offsite as well. And then the other thing with backup is to just make sure you're taking regular backups. If you're taking backups once a year and you get hit with an attack in December, you may have lost the whole year of data. So making sure we're taking backups, at a regular basis, whatever makes sense for your organization, to make sure we're able to recover if we ever do end up losing data. All right. Moving on, wanted to just have a spotlight on the password length and complexity. Yeah, I feel like a lot of folks know it's important to have complex and a lot of characters in their password. One thing I just wanted to highlight here is why. If you remember not a few, but like a while ago, it was common practice to have passwords that are 8 characters or longer, and then the standard went up to 10 characters with either a number, and then it was 12 with a number and a digit and a special character, and then it was 14, and now it's 16. So the reason the password complexity requirements keep going up is because computers these days are just getting faster and faster, and it's becoming easier and easier for computers to crack your password. So as you can see on the screen, passwords that we thought were strong a decade ago with 8 characters, it might take a computer a few hours to guess that password. So as computers get faster and better at guessing your passwords, we need to stay vigilant and keep increasing the complexity of our passwords that we're using. Just a tip I want to give here is to try and use a password manager to generate and store complex passwords. That way you only need to remember 1 password to your password manager, and then your password manager can manage the rest of your passwords. It's just important to make sure that password for your password manager is very secure. Yeah, because if your password manager password gets leaked or gets hacked, the malicious actor has access to everything. I know we're running out of time a little bit, so I'll just speed through this. Won't spend too much time on the passwords. Wanted to move on to awareness and training. Since a lot of you are, joining the call today, to some extent understand the importance of cybersecurity, and why, learning more about it is helpful. So, I mean, kudos to everyone that's on the call and wants to learn more about cybersecurity. Just wanted to highlight a couple of things on the slide here. I won't go through everything, but why cybersecurity training? One of the things we want to highlight is, cybersecurity is complex, and the more you know about it, the more you can recognize and avoid potential threats. Preventing cybersecurity incidents is much better and a lot more effective than dealing with the aftermath of a cybersecurity incident. So, if we can prevent things, we can avoid, common cybersecurity pitfalls. We can just, not have to worry too much if we know that we have, the right education as part of the organization, that we're able to, recognize and avoid some of these common pitfalls. Some of the benefits that result from, good and effective cybersecurity training are enhanced security posture in your organization, data breach mitigations, and phishing awareness. Won't go into too much in detail, but I think the big one here to highlight is the phishing awareness. Rishabh mentioned that it's one of the more common cybersecurity or methods that malicious actors use to get into your organization. So, if you're able to successfully identify phishing emails, you can prevent a whole slew of potential malicious actors trying to get access to your organization's information. And finally, on the screen is tips for building a cyber-aware culture. One of the things that we've seen that is very effective is appointing a security champion. So giving someone in the organization the responsibility to own cybersecurity across the organization and check in on cybersecurity practices on a regular basis. Again, for different organizations, this will be different. It may be monthly, it may be quarterly, but just having that regular check-in, just so you're able to stay on top of things as they come up. Number 2 and 3 are more around training. One is to create engaging training methods. So whether this is interactive, whether you gamify some of the cybersecurity training, anything that you can use to keep your employees engaged and aware on the latest in cybersecurity, the better. I'll move on then to the next slide. Over here we have just a slide on cybersecurity insurance. So we wanted to cover a few areas here. One is what does cyber insurance cover? What's the difference between first party and third party coverage? Tips on choosing a policy, and how good cybersecurity affects security insurance premiums. So the first topic here is what does cyber insurance cover? So it covers things like data breaches, ransomware attacks, and business interruptions. So it can cover, depending on which plan or policy you're going with, costs related to data recovery, notification, credit card monitoring for affected individuals. And for things like ransomware attacks, it could also include payments for the ransom demands and potentially costs for restoring that data as well. Again, if you have the backups, this is where that can come in really handy. Cyber insurance can also cover business interruption. So if you're, down for a few hours, you're down for a week, some policies can cover and can compensate you for lost income due to those cybersecurity incidents. The next one here is just wanted to note on what's the difference between first party and third party coverage. So first party coverage, protects your business from direct losses. So this could be things such as data restoration, business interruption, and reputational damage. So it'll cover costs associated with losses result from those. Third party coverage covers claims made against your business by customers or other third parties. So if you lost credit card data for your users and someone's gone and spent X amount of dollars, third party coverage can help pay for that. Tips on choosing a policy. So again, your policy depends on a few things. One is, what is your cybersecurity level? Obviously, the more mature you are in terms of your cybersecurity, you don't need as much coverage. Whereas, if you're very vulnerable, you might want to opt for more coverage. So that's the first one there on your risk profile. You also want to evaluate your coverage options, looking at things like first-party coverage, third-party coverage, and whether it's covering things like data breaches, ransomware, or business interruption. And as with anything, you make sure you're reading the fine print. Check for policy limits and exclusions that may apply. I think I already spoke about how having good cybersecurity, affects premiums. But evaluators are trying to protect themselves as well. So they're trying to see how likely is it that you'll be vulnerable to a cybersecurity attack. So they're looking at things like, what are you doing to reduce the risk of a cybersecurity incident? So anything that you're doing, they're going to want to take a look at. And even doing things like, regular training or performing audits or testing your systems can help reduce rates. All right, I do want to jump over to the next slide here. I'll hand it over to Rishabh to kind of recap today's session and talk about some quick wins and additional resources.
Thanks, Vanil. So, I mean, it's almost been an hour since we started talking, right? You've heard a lot of different things. You've heard a lot about cyber attacks, malicious actors, cyber threats, some tips and tricks, passwords, cyber insurance. A whole lot of information was thrown at you in a short amount of time. So we just wanted to summarize all of that and, really kind of let you take away what were the key takeaways really, right, from this call. That if we had to summarize everything, here's what you can kind of do in your daily lives as well as your business lives to improve your security posture. Number one, really the most important one I think that we wanted to cover from the tips and tricks section was improving your access control. So as a small business and a smaller organization, you don't necessarily have the complexity of a huge technology stack that some of the bigger organizations would. But access control is still one of those main things that you need to watch out for. Identity and access management is really like the heart and soul of cybersecurity at the end of the day, because it's the nexus, the entry point into your environment a lot of the times, right? So what you can kind of do to protect yourself from the get-go is enabling MFA. Sure, strong passwords are great, and the longer and more complex you make them, the better they are and the less susceptible they are to brute force attacks. But having those additional layers of security, that defense in depth that MFA brings to the table, can really protect you even more. Passwords, if they get leaked, they can be accessed by or used by anybody across the world, right? But MFA is something that can protect you because they need the device that you would have on your own being at all times. So it adds that additional layer of security that really does help you at the end of the day. Having a strong, unique password, yes, it's very important. But even more important nowadays, because having unique passwords across all your accounts, which can, be like tens, hundreds, thousands, if even, right? I don't even remember how many accounts I have at the end of the day. I make a new one like every other month at this point. It's hard. It really is. You can't remember passwords and you can't remember complex passwords across all of them. So having a password manager really does help at the end of the day. That way, you only need to remember one unique, strong, complex password, and the rest of them are protected, hopefully, if you're using a good one, in this password manager. And nowadays, password managers can create complex passwords for you. That way, you don't even need to like think of what you can create and what you can't create because they'll just do it for you. And you only need that one password for the password manager. If you're a bit more of a bigger organization, let's say you've got a number of employees underneath you in your organization, when you are creating user accounts for these folks, just watch out for them, right? Like when you are making accounts and people come and go, remove accounts from older employees. One of the things we find in our client's environment is, right, like they'll onboard employees and they'll create user accounts, they'll give them X amount of access to certain number of resources, but when they leave, nobody really keeps track of that. You have to really make sure those employee accounts are removed at the end of the day because even if they leave the organization, their account still exists in your environment. So if they can still log on with whatever username or password you gave them, well, that's bad, right? That's an easy entryway into your environment from someone that isn't authorized to be there. And last but not least is limiting admin access. So admin access really is kind of like the access that lets a user like act as an administrator, which is basically like the highest level of authority on a computer system. You don't want everybody to have the highest authority on a computer system. You only want them to have the authority and the permissions that are relevant to their role, because not everybody needs the most highest set of permissions. And I say this is important because when I was going through my internship, I would frequently annoy the sysadmin for elevated privileges because it was annoying going through a ticket every time and they would just give it to me. And realizing that now, that's a really bad security practice. So really restrict the amount of permissions that you give employees to whatever they need for their day-to-day operations. Number two, like Vanil mentioned previously, back up your data, plan for disruptions. Disruptions at this point is not like an if, but it's really a when. It doesn't even have to be a cyber incident. Disruptions can happen. Data can get corrupted. Operations can go down. Having strong backups really protects you against that because then you can roll back to whatever previous backup that you had taken. And the more frequent backups you're taking, the more information you have, or the easier it is for you to roll back to your operation. So follow the 3-2-1 backup rule, have multiple copies of backups, have them across different mediums of storage, at least try to keep one offsite. If you're a smaller organization, you're probably using some sort of cloud services provider like Azure or AWS, so you can take advantage of a lot of the tools that come with them. It's not like you need to keep backups on-prem or offsite on, like on tape or hard drives, but it is possible. Drives are cheap nowadays, like 5 terabytes drive, like costs what, like $100. Take advantage of it because it'll protect you more at the end of the day than whatever that $100 would get you otherwise. Test those backups. So taking backups is not that hard, right? Like you can take them. If you're on using cloud service providers like AWS or GCP or Azure, it's easy to you can trust that those organizations are protecting your information. You can take advantage of the tech stack that they have. But if you're taking backups on tape or on drives, test them that they actually work because they're not going to be working forever, right? Like if you're protecting it on, or if you're taking backups on USBs or drives, they need to be plugged in every few months or years so that the data doesn't get corrupted or it disappears. So taking backups is important. Testing backups is just as important because the whole point of a backup is to be able to use them and bring your operations back if something goes wrong. But if they don't work, then they're not worth anything. And finally, this gets more important the bigger your organization gets and the more you scale up. But having an incident response plan, no matter what the size of your organization is, again, important because this is just like comes down to basic human instinct. If something goes wrong, people panic. Having a plan, an actual written out plan on what to do for certain scenarios if something does go wrong, and having resources, like actual resources that you can reach out to, again, when something goes wrong is really important because like I said, right, like people panic. And when something does go wrong, you really don't know what to do because you're like, oh shit, do I need to do this? Do I need to do that? Like, what should I really do? People panic. It happens. It's okay. You're human at the end of the day. But having a plan, a written plan, that's something tangible that you can like check when something does happen will not only help you, but also help your employees because while maybe you as a leader of your organization or as a director would know what to do, but they might not. So if there's dedicated resources that you want them to reach out to, or if certain steps you want them to take, having it written down in a plan would really help them. And finally, I know we've spoken a lot and given you a lot of information, but this barely scratches the surface of cybersecurity and what resources exist out there. If you're more interested in this space and you want to reach out, or if you want to look deeper into what you can do to protect yourself or just not even protect yourself, but go even further than that. There's a lot of resources out there that you can take advantage of from a lot of different and reputable organizations. Some of the major ones in Canada are like the Canadian Center for Cybersecurity. They have a lot of good information on how you can stay cyber aware, how you can protect yourself and your organization, and how you can get one step ahead of malicious actors so that you can stay protected and stay on top of these things. Get Cyber Safe is another really good one. The one we really like and we recommend to a lot of our clients is the NIST standards. So NIST stands for the National Institute of Security and Technology. It's a US-based organization, and while I know we're not really, promoting and trying to use US-based organizations, they really do break down cybersecurity in tangible terms that make it easy for non-security and technology folks to understand. And that's why we recommend it to a lot of our clients, simply because it makes it digestible. So if there are certain things that you want to look into, NIST gives a lot of good information on that. So those are some of the resources that we recommend that folks look into if you are interested in more in the cyberspace and protecting yourself and even getting ahead of malicious actors in the cyberspace.